Chapter 3: The Network Recovers America. Two men, Cecil Rhodes and Lord Milner, played an indispensable role in the creation and expansion of the network. Their actions changed the world forever, and for that reason, no depiction of the network, or modern history for that matter, would be complete without mentioning their names. Likewise, two additional men played an indispensable role in helping the network achieve one of its crucial goals: regaining control of the United States of America. The first man, Edward Mandell House, was clearly a willing and deceptive servant. The second man, President Woodrow Wilson, was almost certainly a well-meaning dupe. But before bringing these two additional characters into the story, let's touch on why it was necessary for the network to recover the United States and destroy its political and economic sovereignty. Global Domination 101. There's always one non-negotiable element in any plan to secure global domination: sovereign nations. Truly independent nations cannot be tolerated. Why? Because global domination is about centralizing all power into the would-be ruler's hands. Independent nations impede this consolidation and disturb the proper chain of command. This seems straightforward enough, but since it's rarely boiled down to its simplest form, it's worth repeating. To rule the world, you must first destroy national sovereignty. You must consolidate and control the real levers of power, regardless of the different forms of government that appear in each country. If democratic forms of government can persuade the majority to accept your global policies, then democratic forms should be used. If tyrannical forms of government are more effective at gaining compliance, then let there be tyranny. If shifting from one form of government to another, turning nations and societies on their head, provides an opportunity to obtain your objectives, so be it. All that truly matters is that you control the leaders who appear to hold power, and that you contain or destroy those leaders if they forget, or simply haven't realized, who the real master is. This is what Quigley meant when he said the network's members are, quote, satisfied to possess the reality rather than the appearance of power. To the extent that they direct the political and economic machinery of nations, and to the extent they can destroy national sovereignty and impose their policies on the citizens of the world, they possess the reality of power. Accordingly, anything that weakens national sovereignty is their ally. Anything that strengthens it is their enemy. Unfortunately, as Ed Griffin points out in the Quigley formula, many people struggle to believe that their highly respected leaders are conspiring to cheat them out of truly representative government. After all, our leaders are constantly singing the praises of representative government. They tell us that the citizens are sovereign, voters control national policies, and any suggestion to the contrary is ridiculous. After a lifetime of being fed this version of reality, the idea of a global conspiracy to destroy national sovereignty, involving both government and government advisors, is understandably difficult to accept. But the greatest weapon against knee-jerk disbelief often comes directly from the conspirators themselves. For instance, Arnold J. Toynbee, a high-ranking member of the network, left little doubt when he wrote, "I will hereby repeat that we are at present working discreetly but with all of our might to wrest this mysterious political force called sovereignty out of the clutches of the local national states of the world. And all the time we are denying with our lips what we are doing with our hands." As Quigley discovered, the Council on Foreign Relations, or CFR, is nothing more than a front group for the network. This being the case, its position on national sovereignty is predictable. Here are a few choice quotes from CFR members taken from Dishonest Money, Financing the Road to Ruin, page 69. "The House of World Order will have to be built from the bottom up rather than from the top down. An end run around national sovereignty, eroding it piece by piece, will accomplish much more than the old-fashioned frontal assault." CFR member Richard Gardner. "We shall have world government, whether or not we like it. The question is only whether world government will be achieved by consent or by conquest." CFR member James Paul Warburg. Some dilution of the sovereignty system as it prevails in the world today must take place, to the immediate disadvantage of those nations which now possess the preponderance of power. The United States must be prepared to make sacrifices in setting up a world politico-economic order. CFR member Foster Dulles. Admiral Chester Ward, a longtime CFR member who later became a harsh critic, summed up the prevailing goal of the CFR this way, quote, "The submergence of U.S. sovereignty and national independence into an all-powerful one-world government." Again, this policy toward national sovereignty shouldn't come as a surprise. The CFR is simply a creation of the network, and as such, it was created to help the network achieve its goals. And though the CFR is just one of many instruments in the network's arsenal, it is among the most powerful. Even though CFR members constitute only about 0.0015% of the U.S. population, they have held and currently hold an inexplicably high percentage of the most influential positions in our society. Almost all of America's leadership has come from this small group. That includes presidents and their advisors, cabinet members, ambassadors, board members of the Federal Reserve System, directors of the largest banks and investment houses, presidents of universities, and heads of metropolitan newspapers, news services, and TV networks. Now, before moving on, it's worth mentioning one additional and extremely important reason why the network sought to regain control of the United States. Just as the British government became a powerful instrument in the network's toolbox, the United States offered an even greater opportunity. By seizing control of U.S. foreign policy, the network could now access the untapped military, economic, and political resources of America. It could use those resources to continue what's best described as its sovereignty destruction project. As an added bonus, it could chain the political consequences and inescapable debt to the United States. And that's exactly what it's done. For instance, since it was founded in 1947, the CIA, a creation of the network, has been used to destabilize and topple dozens of uncooperative nations covertly, while the U.S. military, controlled by policymakers that are dominated by the network, has been used to topple dozens directly. Again, the costs and blowback accrue to the United States. The benefits go to the network. True, the United States does enjoy the benefit of appearing supremely powerful, but this is only a cruel joke. When the network is satisfied that all major obstacles to its unelected rule have been removed, it will be a simple matter to destroy the U.S. dollar, justifiably cut off the flow of money and credit to the United States, and create the political incentive or necessity for the United States to fully enter the new global system. Obviously, none of the network's actions to this point, and none of its future plans, would have been possible without first seizing the levers of power in the United States. So for now, let's return to the two men who made that possible. A willing and deceptive servant. An unattractive and physically average man stands, alone and depressed, beneath an oak tree at the prestigious West Point Military Academy. It's graduation day. In the distance, his peers, the class of 1920, anxiously await their chance to lead the Army and the free world into the 20th century. The President of the United States, his Secretary of Defense, and other distinguished guests are in attendance to honor the occasion, and this adds to what most see as an already intoxicating atmosphere. All are filled with excitement and a sense of purpose. All but the man who stands beneath the oak. Unlike his peers, he's paid attention to the world around him. He's studied the insidious influence of unrestrained wealth tearing at the fabric of the nation. Even the Army itself had become little more than a prostitute in recent decades, forced to serve the interests of those who had accumulated riches beyond all bounds of need. He quietly dreams of a much-to-be-desired state of society, built upon the tenets of, quote, socialism as dreamed of by Karl Marx. Our hero, a masterly man of prodigious intellect, resolves to hasten a revolutionary adjustment of U.S. society. But before he can fix the republic, he must first destroy it. He must overthrow the government, declare himself dictator, and shred that obsolete and vulgar document on which the Republic was founded, the U.S. Constitution. He alone will decide the laws of the nation. He will ensure the desires of the people are better met. Unless, of course, some of the people desire to resist his edicts. There will be no representation for them. They'll be put to death. Likewise, the exercise of free speech against the dictator's policies will not be tolerated. Now, if you were reading this book rather than listening to it, you would have noticed multiple footnotes that reference another book entitled Philip Drew, Administrator. It's a novel originally published anonymously in 1912. Why reference this novel, you ask? Because we can learn a great deal about the willing and deceptive servant, Edward Mandell House, from the book's anti-American message. To briefly recap, Philip Drew, Administrator is a tale of an intellectually superior man who conspires to overthrow the U.S. government, assume dictatorial powers, and pave the way for socialism as dreamed of by Karl Marx. Our good-hearted hero concludes, along with other characters in the book, that the people are simply incapable of determining their own best interests. As such, a revolutionary adjustment of their government, whether they like it or not, is necessary. The hero and his fellow conspirators set out to remake the United States as they see fit. And they succeed. If you haven't already guessed, Philip Drew, Administrator was written by none other than Edward Mandell House himself. In the book, House argues that dictatorship is necessary because the rich and powerful have taken control, and they're using their power against the poor and less fortunate. To understand how shamefully cynical this is, consider the fact that House's propaganda was meant to strengthen, not weaken, the same rich and powerful individuals that his book condemned. A quick side note here. This is one of the most common tactics employed by the network for manipulating public opinion. It will point to an injustice, often caused by the network itself, whip up an emotional firestorm, and at the peak of hysteria, offer a solution that furthers its own agenda. Maybe this is why House published his novel anonymously. It'd be pretty hard to hook readers with his fight the elite storyline if they knew the author was one of the first kingmakers in modern American politics. In any event, the book is worth reading, not for its entertainment value, it isn't well written, but because it's a short read that provides many insights into how easily a handful of men can manipulate a democratic system of government. Some notable examples include how a senator can pretend to represent the citizens who voted for him while actually representing the special interests that he was elected to fight, page 35. How kingmakers, before throwing their weight behind a candidate, ensure that the indebted candidate will choose advisors from the kingmaker's approved list, page 38. If a puppet official gets out of line, how to bring them back under control. Use the press to attack them and have other powerful government puppets do the same. Page 46. How to use the regulatory power of government to collect tributes and funnel tax money into companies you choose. How to be generous with other people's money and use that generosity to strengthen your hold on political power. Page 94. The book even takes a few contemptuous shots at the electorate itself. For instance, when describing one of the major instruments that's used to manipulate elected officials, we learn that the press can, quote, make or destroy a man's legislative and political career, and the weak and the vain and the men with shifty consciences that the people in their fatuous indifference elect to make their laws seldom fail to succumb to this subtle influence. Page 120. As already mentioned, House himself was a kingmaker. His connections to the network gave him the power to make or break aspiring politicians, and he exercised this power with great skill. Prior to turning his attention to the national stage, House is credited with helping 4 different candidates secure the governorship of Texas. But of all the kings that House managed to make, none paid better dividends than Woodrow Wilson. Carefully selected and manipulated, House used Wilson to create the 2 essential funding mechanisms for the network's revolutionary adjustment of U.S. society. More specifically, prior to the election of Woodrow Wilson, the network did not possess the power to tax U.S. citizens' income or control the nation's money supply. Wilson signed both of these powers into existence shortly after he took office. More than anything, this enabled House and the network to turn the United States away from sovereignty and toward servitude. Professor Thomas J. Nock provides this keen insight into the relevance of House's book, Philip Drew, Administrator. Philip Drew deserves serious attention, if only for the prophetic self-exposition of its author. Clearly, House's driving ambition in life was to influence the course of history. To an extent, he succeeded. He was right on the mark when he wrote, "I was like a disembodied spirit seeking a corporeal form. I found my opportunity in Woodrow Wilson." Woodrow Wilson, a well-meaning dupe. Before the network chooses a candidate for a particular job, that candidate must be carefully screened. This obviously isn't a problem for those who have intelligence agencies and other investigative resources at their disposal. A vast amount of personal information can be easily collected on any individual. And if the individual looks promising, a recruiter, like Mandel House, will know exactly what buttons to push to entice and/or manipulate the new recruit. To say that Wilson must have looked very promising to the network would be a colossal understatement. He had demonstrated loyalty to the ideals of global government and socialism, as well as contempt for the U.S. Constitution, long before House selected him for the presidency. In his book, To End All Wars, Woodrow Wilson in the Quest for a New World Order, Thomas J. Nock, a supporter of Wilson, provides a detailed look into Wilson's mind. The similarities between Wilson and the so-called hero in Philip Drew, Administrator are very disturbing. Assuming the network sought to establish a centralized world government, they could have hardly found a better advocate than Woodrow Wilson. As early as 1887, Wilson had written of a confederation of empires and expressed his agreement with the central idea behind state socialism. That idea, he wrote, is that no line can be drawn between private and public affairs which the state may not cross at will. It is very clear that in fundamental theory, socialism and democracy are almost, if not quite, one and the same. In Wilson's opinion, the U.S. government needed to move toward centralized socialist control and unlimited power in order to stop, quote, "the aggrandizement of giant corporations that threaten to swallow up not only individuals and small businesses, but democratic government itself." Wilson went on to condemn selfish, misguided individualism and proclaimed, "We ought all to regard ourselves as socialists." He saw that concentrated and unaccountable power had enabled the rich and strong to combine against the poor and weak, and it was high time for government to lay aside timidity and make itself an agency for social reform as well as political control. Each of these arguments is nearly identical to those offered by House's fictional hero, but unlike House, who used the arguments deceptively to justify seizing greater power, Wilson probably believed that his solutions would weaken the monopolistic forces he spoke out against. And if so, this made Wilson much more valuable to the network than the typical insincere politician who'd say anything in exchange for a paycheck and some power. Wilson would openly and passionately build for the network what it could never openly build for itself. But if these aspects of Wilson's personality and ideology were not enough, there was one final asset that the network could exploit. Woodrow Wilson was a man of towering arrogance and hypocrisy. He had no aversion to the creation of imperial power, provided it was directed by the right people, people like himself, no doubt, and provided it was used for the right reasons, also to be determined by the same group. In the case of the United States, he stated, quote, "I believe that God planted in us visions of liberty, that we are chosen to show the way to the nations of the world how they shall walk in the paths of liberty." As with most politicians, when Wilson uses the pronoun we, as in we are chosen, he would have been more honest to use the pronoun I. More to the point, he felt that God had chosen him to secure global liberty by force. And there's at least one reference provided by Sigmund Freud where Wilson drops all rhetorical subterfuge, quote, "God ordained that I should be the next president of the United States. Neither you nor any other mortal or mortals could have prevented it." Additional quotes further clarify the strength of Wilson's ego. For instance, in his confidential journal he wrote, quote, "Why may not the present generation write, through me, its political autobiography?" In an address he gave as president, July 4, 1914, Wilson proclaimed that the role of the United States was to be, quote, "the light which shall shine unto all generations and guide the feet of mankind to the goal of justice and liberty and peace." And to achieve this, Wilson generously pledged every dollar of America's wealth, every drop of her blood, and all the energy of her people. Even Henry Kissinger took aim at Wilson's conceit. He said, quote, "In Wilson's view, there was no essential difference between freedom for America and freedom for the world. He developed an extraordinary interpretation of what George Washington had really meant when he warned against foreign entanglements. Wilson redefined foreign in a way that would surely have astonished the first president. What Washington meant, according to Wilson, was that America must avoid becoming entangled in the purposes of others. But Wilson argued nothing that concerns humanity can be foreign or indifferent to us. Hence, America had an unlimited charter to involve itself abroad. What extraordinary conceit to derive a charter for global intervention from a founding father's injunction against foreign entanglements, and to elaborate a philosophy of neutrality that made involvement in war inevitable." Wilson's desire to create a global power structure that no nation or probable combination of nations could resist, coupled with his Messiah complex, provided the perfect psychological ingredients for turning the man into a useful idiot. Cervanto Gonzalez summed up the final equation perfectly when he wrote, "Wilson was a man intoxicated with the sense of his own importance and historical relevance, and as such, he could be easily manipulated by a trained intelligence officer, like Edward Mandell House." The evidence suggests that this is exactly what happened. The network had no reason to reveal itself or its New World Order plans to Wilson. Rather, it had every reason to let him believe the crusade for global government was his idea, his divine purpose, to make the world safe for democracy. In his book, The New Freedom, Woodrow Wilson spoke out against a shadowy monopolistic power that was exercising undue influence in the United States. He warned his readers, quote, "Since I entered politics, I have chiefly had men's views confided to me privately. Some of the biggest men in the United States, in the field of commerce and manufacture, are afraid of somebody, are afraid of something. They know that there is a power somewhere so organized, so subtle, so watchful, so interlocked, so complete, so pervasive, that they had better not speak above their breath when they speak in condemnation of it." How ironic that the same organized, watchful, and pervasive power is what put Woodrow Wilson in the White House. And this brings us to another very important part of this story. Assuming we accept the fact that Wilson was a dupe, cynically used by the network to further its already established agenda, we still haven't addressed the most impressive swindle of all, that the network successfully duped millions of Americans into electing him in the first place. The election deception. Few voters ever stop to consider the way in which they initially meet their choices for president. If a strange man were to knock on their door and say, "I'm running for president of the United States," there's almost zero chance they'd view him as a legitimate candidate. However, if they meet the exact same stranger through one of the network's main propaganda instruments, such as radio, print, or television, suddenly the reaction is very different. Suddenly, the stranger deserves a serious look. This is what Bernays referred to as one of the most firmly established principles of mass psychology, and the network applies the principle masterfully. Essentially, it's this: the vast majority of people accept the idea that credible individuals and organizations should be trusted to do their reasoning for them. In the case of elections, the public trusts the so-called credible media to narrow the field down to the top-tier candidates. A political sideshow ensues, and at the end, voters choose who they'd prefer to have in office. But their choice isn't what they perceive it to be. Sure, they are technically choosing who they prefer, but they're choosing from a list of candidates that was chosen for them. Sadly, this sleight of hand works just as well today as it did 100 years ago. and unless this concept becomes widely understood, it'll work 100 years from now as well. Returning to Bernays from his book, Propaganda, quote, "Political campaigns today are all sideshows, all honors, all bombast, glitter, and speeches. These are, for the most part, unrelated to the main business of studying the public scientifically, of supplying the public with party, candidate, platform, and selling the public these ideas and products." In short, without the network's backing, a candidate will remain a relative nobody in the election. They'll be relegated to begging door to door for enough money to run an almost meaningless advertising campaign. However, with network backing, the candidate can count on millions of dollars in campaign donations, a long list of credible endorsements, and a nearly priceless amount of exposure through the network's propaganda instruments. In the unlikely event that a truly independent candidate emerges with enough money or a large enough following to gain some ground, the network will simply use its instruments to smear and ostracize the candidate and the candidate's supporters. Now, to be clear, this isn't to suggest that the network-backed candidates are necessarily involved in the election deception. President of the United States is a job title that fewer than 45 men have held at the time of publication of this book. The desire to join the ranks of such an exclusive club, with all of its attendant perks, is undoubtedly very real. The candidates might even genuinely disagree with a few positions held by their opponents. In fact, it's even better if they do. The meaningless bickering between them and the partisan hysteria it incites among the public only adds to the overall illusion of voter choice. But on the issues that matter most to the network, each sponsored candidate is virtually identical in value. The beauty of this system is its simplicity. The network scouts potential talent, performs the necessary background checks, and after conveying its expectations, offers its vital assistance to a handful of candidates. After some bombast, glitter, and speeches, the public chooses from the products, party, candidate, and platform, that were put before them. Now, let's quickly expand a little on how and why the network ousted incumbent President William Howard Taft and installed Woodrow Wilson. Summary of the 1912 coup. The 1912 election presented an incredible opportunity for the network. Although William Howard Taft had served the conspirators well by openly entertaining the idea of relinquishing U.S. sovereignty and supporting the network's long-sought funding mechanism, the income tax, he failed to support the one measure that was more important than all others. He refused to support Nelson Aldrich's plan to hand the nation's money supply over to the network through the creation of a central bank. Since the central bank was necessary to truly dominate the United States, Taft's rejection of the Aldrich plan constituted a major transgression. But there was a remedy, and that remedy's name was Woodrow Wilson. Wilson had done more than openly entertain the idea of relinquishing national sovereignty. He developed a near-fanatical obsession with the idea. There would be no problem getting him to passionately evangelize the New World Order on behalf of the network. It would also be no problem getting Wilson to sign the network's income tax scam into law. The income tax was sold as a way to punish the rich and enrich the poor. In reality, the tax simply extracts money from U.S. citizens and dumps it directly into the network's projects and pockets. Last, but certainly not least, control of the nation's money supply would be far easier to secure with Wilson in the White House. For one reason, Wilson admitted that he really didn't understand central banking, and this was very convenient. The network could provide all the right advisors, steering the creation of the so-called Federal Reserve System from start to finish. Another reason the central bank would be easier to secure under Wilson is because the entire issue had been successfully framed in partisan terms. That is, a previous central bank plan had been put forward by Republican Senator Nelson Aldrich. Since everyone knew that Aldrich was a business insider, the legislation was shot down by Democrats when it bore his name. For this, the Democrats were largely seen as having protected the little guy from another big business Republican scheme. With the people convinced that the Democrats had protected them, any alternative central bank plan put forward under a Democratic administration would rouse far less suspicion. The network could simply drop the name Aldrich, wrap the legislation in some progressive rhetoric, and sell the exact same thing with Wilson and his Democratic administration acting as trusted pitchmen. Like the income tax, the central bank would be presented as a way to protect the people from the rich and powerful. In truth, it accomplished the exact opposite. A quick side note here. The central bank issue is so crucial to the network's plan for dominating the world that I've written an entire book on the subject. A sizable amount of the next chapter will be devoted to this topic. But for now, here's what Quigley said the network intended to create with its central banking power. Quote, "A world system of financial control in private hands able to dominate the political system of each country. The apex of the system was to be a private bank owned and controlled by the world's central banks, which were themselves private corporations. Each central bank sought to dominate its government by its ability to control treasury loans, to manipulate foreign exchanges, to influence the level of economic activity in the country, and to influence cooperative politicians by subsequent economic rewards in the business world." As a quick reminder, this isn't a case of Quigley guessing at the network's intentions. He speaks with the authority of a man who, in his own words, knows of the operations of this network, because he, quote, "studied it for 20 years and was permitted for 2 years in the early 1960s to examine its papers and secret records." So in comparing the Republican candidate, Taft, to the Democratic candidate, Wilson, there was no question who the network wanted more. The decision was made. Mandel House paid Wilson a visit, and the process of grooming Wilson for the presidency began. In November 1911, Wilson met Colonel Edward Mandel House, one of the first kingmakers in modern American politics. "Almost from the first," the colonel later recalled, "our minds vibrated in unison. Wilson concurred. Mr. House is my second personality. His thoughts and mine are one." James Perloff describes a follow-up meeting at the Democratic Party headquarters in New York. Wilson received an indoctrination course from the leaders convened there, during which he agreed in principle to do the following if elected: support the projected Federal Reserve or central bank, support income tax, lend an ear to advice should war break out in Europe, lend an ear to advice on who should occupy his cabinet. House pulled all of the necessary strings to ensure the Democratic nomination for president went to Wilson. But as impressive as that level of influence might be, it's still a long way from actually putting a man in the White House. And unfortunately for the network, Taft was heavily favored to win against its preferred candidate. But not a problem. As luck would have it, the network found another potential candidate that it could run against Taft. Not just any candidate, mind you, but a former two-term Republican president. And not just any two-term Republican president, but the same one that Republican President Taft had just replaced in 1909, Teddy Roosevelt. This was a brilliant strategic move. The most obvious reason being, 10 months prior to the 1912 election, Roosevelt had expressed a willingness to support the Aldrich Plan. Therefore, whether Wilson or Roosevelt won, the network could get its central bank. But the most obvious reason isn't the only or best reason for why the network poured more than $10 million, inflation adjusted, into Roosevelt's campaign. Sure, Roosevelt was acceptable, but the network still preferred Wilson. And by splitting the vote, they could have him. Perloff explains. Polls showed incumbent President Taft as a clear favorite over the stiff-looking professor from Princeton. So, to divide the Republican vote, the network put money behind Teddy Roosevelt on the Progressive Party ticket. J.P. Morgan and Company was the financial backbone of the Roosevelt campaign. The strategy succeeded. Republican ballots were split between Taft and Roosevelt, and Woodrow Wilson became president with only 42% of the popular vote. The full results of the 1912 election were as follows. Wilson received 41.8% of the vote. Roosevelt received 27.4%, and Taft received only 23.2%. How is that for impressive? William Howard Taft, a man who would have handily won the election with a strong majority, wound up dead last in a three-way race against two network-manufactured candidates. Edward Mandel House summed it up this way: Wilson was elected by Teddy Roosevelt. The rest, as they say, is history. After the election, House proceeded to fill the president's important cabinet positions with the best advisors the network had to offer. He guided Wilson's policy decisions like a disembodied spirit that had found its opportunity to shape the world with Wilson's hands. Before the end of 1913, the income tax would be law. Before the end of 1913, the central bank would be a reality. These new instruments provided the funding and leverage that the network needed to greatly accelerate its sovereignty destruction project. But they alone would not provide the greatest opportunity to capitalize on Wilson's evangelical crusade to make the world safe for democracy. Only a long and protracted world war, with funding guaranteed by the new instruments, could achieve that. Once again, as luck would have it, just such an opportunity presented itself shortly after Wilson took office. World War I provided the political impetus for the network's first major attempt at establishing a global government, the League of Nations. And although it wasn't as successful as they might have hoped, the League of Nations, along with all the other instruments that came into existence under Wilson, laid the foundation for all of the network's progress over the past 100 years.